Let's talk.
Giles Brown.
Scouse Republic, an alternative history of Liverpool, is a fascinating and fabulous new book by David Swift, placing a city which is unlike any other. I have been looking forward to doing this interview all week. Delighted to welcome onto the show David Swift. Good morning to you, David.
Morning, Giles.
Good to have you with us. For those who don't know, just explain a little bit about who you are and why you are uniquely qualified to give us an alternative history of Liverpool.
Well, I'm from Liverpool myself, although many years ago. As a lot of people comment to me, you don't necessarily sound that Scouse, although I suppose that's in the eye or the ears of the beholder, you could say. And so I was a kind of academic historian. And, back in the day, you wouldn't often see the history of Liverpool or UK cities in generally taken that seriously in academia, right? But actually, this is a massive oversight. And I think there's a real need to appreciate the different and individual history of certain UK cities. And Liverpool's right up there, as you say, as one of the most interesting and bizarre in some ways UK cities. And definitely it's very different from some of the others. So that's why I thought I'd write this book.
And the other thing about Liverpool, of course, is the way that it has reinvented itself. I mean, first time I went to Liverpool was on a school trip and this will date me. I think it was 1978. And exactly, it was wet. It was cold. We went to, because our form teacher was from Liverpool. I remember freezing the proverbials off on the Mersey ferry. It was great. It was dirty. The Cavern Club was just a shell. And there was an awful lot of empty space, which at the time I didn't clock, but that was the damage from the bombs, from the Liverpool Blitz. And then I went back for Euro 96 as a guest of the MDC, and I was just blown over by the way that it had regenerated itself. There was a buzz about the city. It was, Liverpudlians have always been friendly, but I was just completely blown away about the whole renaissance of Liverpool. So what's your starting points with this, Dave?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's interesting, as you say, something that's helped Liverpool actually with its renaissance is the fact that it used to be so skint. And I'll explain what I mean by that. If you go to the centre of Birmingham or Manchester, Leeds to some extent, you'll see a lot of really ugly, horrible 1960s buildings because they had money back in the 60s to kind of redevelop the city centre and often in quite an ugly way. But because Liverpool was so skint post-Second World War, there wasn't that money really for kind of redevelopment and to deal with bomb sites and all that kind of stuff, which meant that, as late as the 70s, even the 80s, frankly, you could see Second World War bomb sites that still hadn't been cleaned up. The upside of that is, though, so much of the gorgeous kind of Georgian architecture and actually kind of, Victorian and Georgian architecture you can see in Liverpool city centre, it's still there. It hasn't been touched. It wasn't knocked down in the 60s and replaced with various monstrosities. We do have one monstrosity called St. John's Beacon, which is this kind of, I think it had a revolving restaurant at the top back in the day, which seemed like a good idea in the 60s, but it's not used for that anymore. But in general, we got all that really nice architecture. And again, the kind of heritage of the place, which, like you say, and it might surprise people, certainly might surprise people the amount that people from Liverpool go on about the Beatles. But until fairly recently, the council wasn't that good at exploiting like Beatles heritage and stuff. I remember with my mates, we used to go out drinking around Matthew Street by where the Cavern was about 20 odd years ago. And even then, 20 years ago, it was still kind of underdeveloped. But I think in recent years, like a lot of UK cities, actually, Liverpool's really been focusing on tourism. It's been focusing on its kind of cultural heritage, on sport, on music, on universities as well. I mean, don't forget Liverpool is it was actually the original red brick university, Liverpool University, so it has this long history of kind of scholarship and academia as well. And I think one of the interesting things about Liverpool is it's always had this economy based on kind of service sector. Back in the day, it was based on the docks. It was based on sailors and on the kind of, the attendant industries to that, right? Like,
well put, David. Absolutely. Fist that backhand down the line. Yeah, I like that.
I mean, again, if you read the book, a big theme of the book actually is Liverpool's long history of kind of drunkenness and all kinds of things like
revelry, shall we say? Yeah. Revelry.
And I think a lot of cities now, because of the way the UK economy and in fact the economy of much of Europe is going really, where, we've had this decline of industry and manufacturing, the rise of kind of service sector employment. I think in some ways Liverpool could kind of stole a march on a lot of its rivals simply because it never had actually a really strong manufacturing industry like, say, Manchester did, or Leeds, or Sheffield, or Birmingham, or whatever. Instead, it was always based on this kind of, more casualized economy. And so as we're now in a more casualized economy, I think cities, somewhere like Liverpool, is well placed to benefit from that, really.
But the other thing, of course, is that people overlook the docks. I mean, Liverpool was the entry point to America. John, for example, John Peel. I mean, he got, the Beatles. Everybody got their imports. It didn't come in by Bristol or London. It came in by Liverpool with the soldiers or whoever was getting ships over to Liverpool. And let's get this one out of the way first of all. It was huge in the slave trade, as was Bristol. I mean, Liverpool was Liverpool has a checkered history from that point.
Oh, definitely. Yeah. I mean, that's it. This, the modern day image of Liverpool and Scouse as being kind of Bolshevik, left wing, etc. That's a very, very, very modern thing, really, from the 1980s onwards, frankly. And, until the 1980s, I mean, when you went back in the 70s, there were many Tory MPs still, representing Liverpool constituencies, not for the past 30 years, but still. And definitely for much of its history, obviously the slave trade was massive and really important for the economy of the city. It was an extremely kind of rich place, right, in terms of the wealth that was there. It didn't mean the ordinary people were rich, of course, but the broader economy of Liverpool was extremely wealthy and influential. It was massive, not just in the slave trade, but in kind of transatlantic and global shipping. I think as late as about 1914, with the start of the First World War, I think about 1/8 of all goods in the world, right, went through the Liverpool docks, or the Liverpool docks account for about 1/8 of all goods in the world. Compare that to nowadays. The biggest docks in the world now are in Shanghai and Singapore, and they definitely account for far less of world trade than the Liverpool docks did back in their heyday just over 100 years ago. So I think to understand the modern identity of Liverpool, you firstly got to understand just how rich and successful it used to be. And then things went badly wrong from the kind of start of the 20th century onwards, mostly just because of the relocation of trade, right? With the decline of Atlantic trade to America and to the British Empire, and the real growth of trade with Europe. So that was great for Southampton. It was great for Great Yarmouth and Felixstowe and places like that. But it was pretty bad for kind of western ports like Glasgow, Liverpool and Bristol, and particularly Liverpool, because it was so dependent on the docks and on maritime trade.
But I mean, I said I'm from Stoke-on-Trent. The clue is in the name, the Trent, and it was the Trent and Mersey Canal, which connected Liverpool to the great industrial heartlands.
Exactly, that's it. So there was this. I mean, again, this kind of Liverpool-Manchester rivalry is, again, a pretty recent thing, right? So Liverpool used to be so well connected to places like Stoke, Manchester, Leeds. They used to have this kind of symbiotic relationship, if that's not too fancy a word for 10:30 on a Friday or Thursday morning. They used to have this kind of relationship where Liverpool was the importing and exporting place, but potteries from Stoke, cotton from Manchester, etc. That's where the kind of raw materials would come in and the finished product would go out. So, so much of 100 years ago, like the wealth of Britain really came from the top down. It came from the north down. It came from Scotland. It came from the north and the Midlands of England. That's where the wealth of Britain was generated 100 years ago. Obviously, things have very much changed since then. But I think if you're going to understand the modern day identity of Liverpool, you need to understand how rich it used to be and exactly what kind of hard times it fell on, really.
And that wealth attracted people to come in there. And if you look west, if you were to paddle over, you're going to hit the Republic. And that is, again, the Irish connection with Liverpool and what makes it such a diverse, a diverse city. And also, more so than any other English city, you have that sectarian line as well.
Yeah, exactly. This is something that people completely forget about now. Because, I mean, I remember when I was growing up in Liverpool in the kind of, I suppose, early, like in the 90s, basically, we didn't know many Protestants. Like, you didn't see that many. I mean, I think I knew more Jewish people or Hindus probably than I knew Protestants, right? There was this one Protestant at our school, and we all kind of took the mickey out of him. And it's not, no one's exactly sure why that's the case, because Catholics tend to have more kids, because a lot of the Protestants kind of moved out in the post-war decades or whatever. There are still Protestants in Liverpool, but it's an overwhelmingly Catholic city now, I think, or mostly. And that never used to be the case. It used to be massively divided. You used to have huge riots on, like, St. Patrick's Day, in the July marching season for Protestants, etc. All of that kind of stuff. It used to be like Belfast or Glasgow, really, where you'd have, priests getting attacked and like marches being beaten up and churches getting bombed, all this kind of stuff, really. And again, that's kind of like brushed under the carpet now to some extent. But it's a hugely important part of the city's identity. nowadays it's kind of associated with kind of the Irish influence, but actually Scousers about 100 years ago very much resented this kind of influx of Irish people and often fought against them.
Well, here's a question. Scouse. I mean, is it a term of abuse? I mean, obviously, I'm down in Marbella. We've got quite a few, and honestly, good night out or what. But a lot of Scousers there. But I'm never quite sure whether you can use it as somebody who's not from Liverpool.
Oh, definitely, yeah. I mean, I'm assuming it can be used as a term of abuse by outsiders, but definitely not. I mean, it's not seen as a term of abuse within Liverpool. So it comes from Scouse, which was a Norwegian stew, or it comes from the dish Scouse, which is basically lamb and potato stew. And that was originally brought over by Norwegian sailors called Scouse. And for some reason, no one's not, a lot of, even though in my brilliant book, you can read almost everything about the history of Liverpool, there's still a lot about the history of Liverpool that's not quite understood, right? And one of those things is exactly why this dish, why this humble dish became like the name for the city and the name for the people from the city. Because as the great Liverpool historian John Belsham, who's an academic at the University of Liverpool, as he once noted, it's very rare for a group of people anywhere in the world to name themselves after food. And especially pretty cheap, accessible, humble food as well. So yeah, it's a bit of an odd one. But even that's quite recent, even I think about 100 years ago, less than 100 years ago actually, people from Liverpool used to refer to themselves as Wacker. Right, Wacker, which I've never heard of. Before I researched this book, I'd never heard of that in my life. And I don't reckon anyone from Liverpool under 40 ever has either. But, for my granddad's generation, that's how they all used to refer to themselves, rather than Scousers. They used to say like Wacker George and stuff like that. They used to call themselves. So, yeah. Strange times.
The book's called Scouse Republic, and again, I grew up I was at school in the 70s and 80s, and I remember look Northwest, because that was what we used to get in Granada TV. Kids, ask your parents. But there is a serious history. We've got the riots, obviously, and then we've got Republic. Derek Hatton and the militant tendency, and that was the People's Republic of militant tendency, wasn't it?
That's it. Again, that's very interesting because Liverpool back in the 1980s was still in many ways pretty right-wing in different ways. I don't just mean in terms of its who they voted for necessarily, because already by the 1980s, Labour was coming in. They still had one Tory MP as late as 1987, I think, which a lot of people are shocked by. But certainly one of the reasons actually that Liverpool the militants took over Liverpool in the 80s, and it was kind of a certain type of very Bolshevik, kind of very socialist Labour, is precisely because there was not that much history of the Labour Party in the city, until the kind of post-war decades. So many kind of Labour heartlands, like the Potteries, like West Yorkshire, East Lancashire, the North East, South Wales. In so many of those areas, you had a long history of trade unionism. You had a long history of religious nonconformity. So like Methodists, Baptists, etc. People going to chapel, people reading the Bible, people trying to, abstain from alcohol and improve themselves. You didn't really have that in Liverpool, basically, because of the docks, because of the importance of shipping. You didn't have kind of stable, regular work the way you did in, say, Stoke or in, Newcastle or Sheffield or wherever, where people could work in the potteries or in the mines or in the steel factories. You definitely didn't really have the kind of religious Protestant nonconformist heritage. You definitely didn't have much of a tradition of kind of teetotal, abstinence, self-improvement, that kind of thing, which happened in so many other places. So Liverpool never really had that proper Labour Party tradition in history, which is exactly why the likes of Millicent could take over so easily, because frankly, there was just not that many people in the Liverpool Labour Party in the 1980s. So when you have this group of, no offence, Degsy, but nutters, basically, they could pretty easily take over because they just didn't have that much opposition.
It's interesting because I went up there. I was editing a property magazine in the early 90s, and I got the tour of the MDC. Went up to New Brighton. They were doing all the stuff that would then become, the Albert Docks and stuff. And I did there. I did Cardiff. I did obviously Docklands. And you thought to yourself, this is a huge investment. Is it gonna work? And how did the people of Liverpool take to the Merseyside Development Corporation coming? Because that was a quango, wasn't it?
Yeah, definitely. I think a lot of people were very skeptical at the time, and a lot of people felt, this is the place that's been abandoned. And there was such a sense of, there was definitely a sense of kind of inexorable decline for many people. The council was producing all kinds of apocalyptic reports and predictions in the 1980s talk about it in the book. And in fact, I've got a picture in the book, and obviously this is not great radio because it's a picture, but you'll have to buy the book to see it, of the Albert Dock in the 1980s, and it looks like an absolute wasteland. People will be familiar. If you've never been to Liverpool, you might be familiar with it from watching This Morning on Granada back in the day when you had Fred the Weatherman.
That was it.
Used to leaf it on the thing, leaf it exactly, on the back. Yeah. So it certainly didn't look like that in the 1980s. There's this picture where it's kind of like all stilted up, and it just looks.
Oh, blimey! Yeah.
It looks like a bump. It's just unrecognisable.
That's how I remember it. My first visit, basically. Yeah.
And frankly, if it wasn't for the likes of Michael Heseltine and the Merseyside Development Corporation, who knows how that would have changed? Who knows? Frankly, all that area might just have been cleared and knocked down and sold for cheap real estate or something, because there simply wasn't at that time the kind of inward private capital investment to regenerate the city by itself. So it definitely needed that kind of helping hand for the government. But frankly, it was long overdue because, not to go back too far to history, but during the Great Depression in the 30s, there were kind of special areas where the government would put lots of investment in. I think Stoke was definitely included. Certainly the North East was, because these areas were so depressed and the government really tried to help them out. But because that really focused on kind of traditional, stable industries that produce stuff, it didn't really help dockers or sailors or that kind of thing. So, for much of the 20th century, Liverpool was kind of left to just kind of rot by itself, unlike other areas. And so it was probably high time that some investment came in, and unfortunately probably took the Toxteth riots in 81 to actually force the government into doing something.
Talking about the Merseyside Development Corporation, I was a guest of the Merseyside Development Corporation. 96, I went to Anfield. First time there. Italy versus Czech Republic. Fantastic. You cannot talk about Liverpool without talking about football. And also Everton, because everything goes, people, I've got loads of friends who are Evertonians as well, but it is, Mark said religion is the opium of the people. And Liverpool, there is the relationship between, we'll talk about the rest, between Liverpool Football Club and the ordinary people. I mean, they've been through triumph and tragedy. When you lot won the Champions League under Klopp, even I had a tear in my eye, because it's the fairy tale story, isn't it?
Yeah, that's it. And obviously, I'm a Red myself, so I've got to kind of pay due respect to Everton, because Everton were first, right? Everton were the first club, right? And then Liverpool kind of broke away from them when the owner of Anfield wanted to basically charge more. So Everton kind of left. And so the owner of Anfield had to make his own club, basically. And yeah, it's interesting because just as the city's fortunes have declined, not by coincidence, that's really where football stepped in, if you like, and became increasingly important to the city. Like I was saying earlier, the whole Liverpool-Manchester rivalry wasn't really a thing until the fortunes of both cities started to decline. And of course, that's exactly when football, Man United, Man City, Liverpool, Everton, that's exactly when football really stepped in. Something to talk about in the book, actually, is the changing fortunes of Liverpool and Southampton over the years, right? 100 years ago, Southampton was kind of an up-and-coming town, but Liverpool was the maritime city for the whole world, really. And that's where one of the signs that things were changing is when White Star Lines, who owned the Titanic and various other liners, moved their headquarters from Liverpool to Southampton. And that was really the signal that times were changing, actually, that, the kind of northwest ports were declining and it was all going to be on the south and the southeast from now on. Well, Liverpool have kind of got their own back recently with Virgil van Dijk, Sadio Mane, and a few other players, we nicked off Southampton. And again, there's something there, right? There's something there because actually as the original kind of wealth and industry declined, so football stepped up and football stepped in as being something that would provide a sense of identity and pride for people. So yeah, for both Reds and Blues, it's really important. And obviously Reds have had more to take pride in recently than Blues.
Yeah, but also, you think about the icons, Dalglish, Jurgen Klopp. Klopp, Liverpool's a club like no other. So there's a connection, and Klopp got that. Dalglish is the elder statesman now, but Klopp, he's a German, as they bombed our chip shop, as the saying goes. But he got it. He really got the connection with the dazzling white teeth, etc. But he will be forever now. In a world where managers come in and come out, and then go off to Saudi Arabia or something, the emotional connection that he got and what he got back from the cop was quite something.
Yeah, definitely. That's it. I think, Klopp, he's such a really interesting fella, and even though he's kind of from the Black Forest, which is miles from the sea, there's no ports around there. There's so much about him which really speaks to the Scouse sensibility. He likes to drink, for example, but he likes to kind of work hard and be successful as well. He doesn't take himself too seriously, as maybe from his massive, slightly oversized white teeth, you can maybe infer that. But at the same time, he takes pride in himself as well. So yeah, I think it was something whereby, he was looking for a kind of project that could, he didn't just want to work anywhere. He didn't just want to get paid and as I say, stay there for a few years and then move on. I think he was really looking to commit to somewhere, and definitely Liverpool were really looking for someone who could kind of commit to them and kind of lift them out of the kind of doldrums that they were in. And I think it's just one of those whereby it turned out to be a perfect match between manager and club, or manager and city, I should say, really. And he's always going to be a hero in Liverpool, definitely.
So where does, two questions. First one, how on earth do you put the whole history of Liverpool in a book without making it, the size of the Wirral or something? How do you sort of boil it all down so it's manageable?
Well, I think Liverpool was founded just over 800 years ago, actually. But for the first kind of 400 to 500 years, not much happened, really. It was kind of a tiny village on the side. It was founded by King John, as I say, over 800 years ago. And it was originally founded as a staging point for his invasion of Ireland, which is something that not a lot of people talk about, but it's very important. And then for hundreds of years, not much happened, really, frankly. And, Chester was a much bigger kind of town nearby than Liverpool was in that whole area. And indeed, actually, not just the slave trade, because actually, even before the slave trade really took off in Liverpool, the town invested in what was then at the time, actually, the world's first wet dock with a gate. So the River Mersey has kind of two tides and stuff. And back then, before the dock was created 300 years ago, if the tide went out, the ships would kind of be stranded on the sand until the tide came in again. So the local corporation had the idea, let's make this kind of dock, which we build specifically with massive wooden gates to stop the water going out. And that really transformed everything, because it became this ideal kind of West Coast port that was further north than Bristol. So the French warships wouldn't try to interfere as much, but not as far north as Glasgow, which was maybe less easy to get to. So that really started to transform things. So my history really kind of kicks off about 300 years ago. Even so, as you say, there's a lot of stuff that goes on in the time. So I try to deal with different themes like economics and trade, politics, football, music, crime, drugs, etc. They all have their own kind of thematic chapter. And some chapters are longer than others. Some chapters are sadder than others, definitely. Some of it is pretty kind of grim stuff. Like the slave trade, obviously, is really kind of depressing. But I try to get through things, in a kind of irreverent way, both trying to inform people, but also hopefully give them a laugh at the same time.
I'm based in Marbella. I think I can skip the crime chapter. Looking at where do you think Liverpool goes then from now? What do you think the future is for it?
Well, it's interesting because obviously there's there are all kinds of economic and social problems in Liverpool, of course, definitely, yeah. Again, when we talk about crime, actually, as many, many, many Scousers will tell you, Liverpool has much lower crime rates for many things than London, Manchester, Birmingham, etc., other major UK cities. Having said that, like everywhere, we still have all kinds of problems. But a big problem in the UK, and lots of kind of Western countries and economies now, is that big cities tend to be doing okay, right? Obviously, there's probably crime and deprivation, etc. But they're doing okay. Things like tourism, universities, football and sports and culture, all that kind of stuff. Big cities are okay. It's the surrounding towns which are often pretty depressed, economically and stuff. So Liverpool's doing okay. It's just more about we need kind of competent governance, which has not always been lacking. Which has not always been there. I might actually be on a show later today with Steve Rotherham, the mayor of Liverpool, so I need to kind of watch my language in case I run into him later. But, it hasn't always had the best governance in recent decades. And definitely we need to kind of find some way to make sure that we need to get more investment, frankly, because Manchester has definitely outstripped Liverpool when it comes to capital investment, when it comes to real estate and construction, as anyone who goes to Manchester can tell you. So we definitely need to improve the way we can attract investment and such. And we need to make sure that it really kind of trickles down or ripples out to the ordinary people more.
The book is called Scouse, Republic, and Alternative History of Liverpool. It's by David Swift, who we're speaking to today. If people want to find you online and say great things to you, David, what websites? Do you TikTok?
Well, I'm on Twitter/X, whatever you prefer to call it. So it's David Swift 87. And that's the best way to find me and contact me if you want to say nice things. If you want to say bad things, just keep it to yourself.
Yeah, send it to me at Talk Radio Europe, and you'll be able to order the book via our own virtual bookstore as always. The book is called Scouse, Republic, an Alternative History of Liverpool. It's by David Swift. Dave, it's been an absolute pleasure to speak to you this morning.
Nice one. So thanks for having me on.